Greetings all, Dr. Garrett here, along with Dr. Harbison. Again, no
Hello.
hello. Are you just antisocial or
Hi.
what? Hi.
Hello.
So anyways, in all seriousness, as you guys know, we are trying to segment out each week into 4 different topics. And so this week, as you guessed, we're going to be talking about movement. Our other 3 weeks, as a refresher, are going to be an academic focus where we're looking at some of the current research on hot button items. We're also going to be looking at a book each month. So we, of course, are welcoming you all to join us there. And then finally is a kind of more candid conversation, lifestyle, student questions, and so forth. So this week, again, is going to be our movement discussion. And as you guessed, we are going to be looking at the push-up. And we're going to be discussing both the standard push-up or a traditional variation, as well as a modified push-up. We had some questions from students about some of the points of performance there. And so we want to make sure that we address those for y'all. But we're going to go ahead and start with our standard push-up. And how this is going to flow is we're going to be discussing the purpose for each of us and where we're pretty much aligned on all these things, but have different perhaps emphasis on some of these. And then we'll discuss the setup, the execution, and the common faults. And hopefully we'll get into the weeds a little bit, but still stay focused enough to gather your attention here. So
my dog is asking for breakfast over here.
What's that?
My dog's whining over here. Sorry. He's asking for breakfast.
Oh, nice. He's hungry just like me.
I don't know if you heard
that. He has to learn about that. Well, you know what's interesting is this is a great segue or precursor to our academic discussion this month, which is going to be around some time restricted feeding. So we're just practicing that on our animals, of course, humanely. Anyways, so Dr. H, talk to me about the purpose of the push-up for you.
Okay, so purpose of push-up, I think for me, very basically, the push-up is a horizontal press, right? We typically look at a bench press or a push-up as kind of synonymous almost. I don't know if that's the right word, but horizontal pressing movements. This one being closed chain, the push-up being open chain. So they're slightly different in that sense, but at the very root level, it's a horizontal push. One of the things, go ahead.
Great verbiage here. So you said open and closed chain. Can you briefly just remind students of the difference between an open and a closed chain exercise? I think that's great that you touched on that.
Sure. I mean, so we'll just keep it simple for this example. So closed chain, the distal attachment, let's say, is the hand is on the ground, attached to the ground, and it's not moving. Mm-hmm. So in a closed chain example of the push-up, the body is moving and the hand, the distal attachment is staying still. Whereas at the bench press, it's the opposite. So open chain, meaning the distal attachment of the hand is what's moving and the body staying still.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. So again, closed chain, horizontal press. So we're, attacking the glenohumeral adductors primarily, are the prime movers there. Certainly the triceps are involved at the elbow as well. But those would be the prime movers. One of the beauties of the push-up that I really think has value in terms of shoulder health, if you look at the idea of scapulohumeral rhythm, is something that if you look at the way the shoulder joint works and how it's designed to work, it works better when the glenohumeral joint, so the actual shoulder joint, works in tandem with the scapulohumeral or scapular thoracic joint. So basically the way the scapula moves on the thoracic or rib cage column. And so with the bench press, oftentimes, and it's really a commonly coached method of bench pressing, is kind of having retracted scapula and just pinning them down against the bench, which certainly can help you press more weight. But I would certainly raise a question mark there in terms of shoulder health over the long term, especially. The scapula is designed to move with the humerus. If you throw a punch or throw a baseball or anything like a spear or something, one of those fundamental movements of the body is throwing. The scapula moves, it protracts as the glenohumeral joint adducts, right? So if we look at kind of that horizontal adduction movement, the scapula begins to protract around the rib cage, right? Mm-hmm. So that is more difficult to mimic in the bench press, whereas with the push-up, we can have more retraction with abduction and then protraction with adduction. And so I think you can make the argument, or I think there is a good argument for this being potentially a more healthy or natural position for the entire shoulder joint, not just the glenohumeral joint, but the scapulothoracic joint as well, to move in tandem together. So that's one of the benefits I see with the push-up, in terms of, if we're gonna program a horizontal pushing movement, I think there's some value in incorporating scapular movement with that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the common faults I see, in fact, with the bench press, and not to get away from the push-up, but because they're so similar, one of those problems that I see with the bench press is the protraction. Someone will finish their rep, and they'll finish by kind of rounding their shoulders forward and into that protraction. And that's very similar to like overextending the spine when they're deadlifting. People will stand up and go beyond this neutral position and drive their hips far forward to where they're kind of arching back. It's almost the same thing. And we typically want to avoid that, specifically with loaded exercises. When we start to get into some of the calisthenic type exercises, although we want to maintain good technique, of course, there's a little bit more freedom in how we can mess with that. And so I think that's a great point that you bring up, that there is more room for this kind of full range of motion, not just at the glenohumeral joint, but the scapulothoracic as well.
And I mean, for the bench press, like one of the reasons we tell people don't protract is most of the time the bench press is more of this might get us into loading, but more of a strength-based movement. And so the goal would be to lift more weight, maximal weight. And by protracting, we're extending the range of motion of the distance that we have to press the bar. And it also gets you out of position for the next rep. It's harder to kind of, when your back is into the bench and you protract it, it's hard to then reset and get back into that retracted position.
Without kind of like, retucking it in almost.
Yep.
So let's talk about loading then, because we're still kind of discussing the purpose here. For me personally, as far as an absolute strength tool, this is not. Now, if someone is, younger in their training age or perhaps deconditioned, this is a great tool to develop a base level of strength to then begin introducing perhaps more free weight exercises or some of these open chain, like you had mentioned, where there's a little bit more stability required there, particularly for this. So as far as an absolute strength tool, again, I would argue it's not, but you can develop strength to get to a baseline. And then from there, once that's developed, there's a level of hypertrophy that may come from this. You see a lot of these folks that do some of the, playground workouts where it's a bunch of push-ups and pull-ups. Now, keep in mind that the amount of volume that they're getting, the variations that they're implementing, and then there's also a gym component. To think that they are that size and don't do anything but calisthenics, there's certainly some exogenous weights being lifted. But one way to build some of the hypertrophy and strength is through variation. And so I think that's where you can make it a little bit more of a strength tool. But at its core, for me personally, this is upper body muscular endurance in the horizontal plane. So say you, Dr. H.
Yeah, I agree. At the very root level, I think because of the fact that you're just dealing with your own body weight, it's very easy to build up into those, higher reps and expecting, basically, I mean, because of the progressive overload nature of, as you adapt to a training program, because your body weight isn't going to massively change, upwards while you're exercising, let's say, adding more external weight just as it is without getting into bands and chains and other, weight vests and things like that. It's, the very nature of progression is going to get you into the hypertrophy and endurance rep ranges. One of the other aspects of loading, or perhaps maybe even purpose, kind of as you were talking, it reminds me of the value of the push-up again or one of the potential values of the push-up, kind of as we talk about the deconditioned athlete. My kind of approach to training the deconditioned athlete is to always start with body weight exercises and develop that kind of base level of strength that you talked about. But you also develop some spatial awareness that I think is important before we start throwing on external resistance, is to understand how your body should be moving just on its own. So I think there's some importance there to approach it in that sense of, hey, let's begin here, even if the load is eventually going to be too little with just our own body weight to effectively target whether muscular strength or hypertrophy, if that be the case. But I think it's a great place to start. and to develop some of that, base level strength, and then get into endurance and maybe perhaps hypertrophy in between. So,
And what are some of the variations that you like? I mean, I guess maybe we should go through variations after we've gone through the basic setup, execution, and common faults. So maybe we'll wait for that or go through those things and kind of come back to the purpose and how, how some of those variations look perhaps. But do you have anything else as far as its benefits like, for example, the application, like for me, you had alluded to this earlier, we're strengthening some of those muscles that support throwing. But this is a great exercise to begin understanding the ability to create space. And that's like the benefit of a bench press, particularly in sport. You look at football and, you have a lineman or a receiver for that matter, that's looking to create space to allow them to move and get into the position they need to get into. You look at wrestling, mixed martial arts, and so on and so forth. There's this horizontal press component in most aspects. Even basketball, you're creating space. Maybe something like baseball, you're not creating space in that way. But again, there's also this horizontal adduction, or this kind of need for a strength and endurance in front of us, or anteriorly. And this is a great way to do that. Do you have any other applications that you find beneficial with the push-up?
So, yeah, the one other aspect I was going to say that you brought to my attention there as you're talking is the trunk. I would say, we'll be talking about kind of how we want to keep the trunk neutral, and how this is, ideally speaking, we're not going to see movement in the lower half. But in order for that to happen, we have to have contraction in you look at this almost like an arch, right? The underside of the body is the supporting structure in this position. That weight is, gravity's pulling the weight down. And so in order to resist that, you have to have the anterior musculature of the rectus abdominis, all the supporting trunk musculature on the anterior half of the body, hip flexors as well. All of that has to be rigid and be able to sustain whatever the external resistance is that you present as a human, your body weight. There's an important component there of stabilization with the trunk. And so basically the idea of being able to stabilize your body as you transmit force elsewhere, kind of stabilizing the trunk and transmitting force distally in the extremities, is exactly what athletics is all about, really. I mean, so many different applications there that are important. So we talk about the shoulder and elbow as primary movers here, but there's a really key component at the trunk where you see a lot of common errors as well. We'll get into that a little bit later, but I didn't want to leave that out as far as the value or purpose of the push-up perhaps too.
Yeah, and not to stretch too far here, but and so there's this isometric contraction occurring, as you mentioned, at the trunk. And then, so how does this translate to everything else? Anything else that requires a neutral spine, we're just reinforcing that here. Are we developing absolute strength at the trunk? No, I'm not making that argument, but this is one of those things where you'll notice a lot of movements will look very similar together. So if I was standing and then going into a squat, I would want the same neutral spinal position. So although that's not the focus of this movement, there is this ancillary or auxiliary kind of benefit to doing this in the manner. So if we're not thinking about engaging our trunk during this exercise, it's kind of low-hanging fruit that we're missing out on that could transfer to a deadlift, to a squat, to anything else that requires a neutral spine. Again, I'm not arguing that this is like the magic maker to allow you to do that in your squat or deadlift, but it is certainly a component here, just like it's a component there. So it's just low-hanging fruit and something to focus on, because one of the common faults that we'll address is this overextended spine or these sagging hips, and that poor mechanics will also likely bleed into your deadlift, your squat, and so on. And that's why it's important to make sure that we have some consistency in our technique throughout, even though the focus here is in the upper body.
Well said.
So let's go into then the setup. I mean, we can make this really bare bones, and then I would rather, because it's such a simple exercise, I would rather almost go into setup of some of the variations that we might see. So for here, we're going to work from the top down. You see a neutral spine from the crown of the head down through the C-spine, through the thoracic region, the lumbar region, through the hips, through the femur, tib, fib, and out through the heel. So we're trying to create as straight of a line as possible with our posture. As far as hand position, we're just outside of the shoulders. fingers are faced forward, and then our elbows are going to be kind of tucked in, but not, I wouldn't say tucked in, just not flared out where the shoulder is internally rotated or should say abducted to get there. But we're going to have kind of more of a 45-degree angle elbow, and we'll show that to you once we get to the execution. Am I missing anything there?
I think so. You kind of touched on the idea of external rotation. I think there's maybe a more advanced technique. We could discuss the idea of torque at the shoulder joint. We don't want to see internal rotation torque. Let me get my hand this way. Internal rotation would be here. External rotation here. So if you are in a fingers straight ahead position, if my hand is stuck here, I can still you can still change you can see kind of my shoulder joint. You can still rotate in and out. And so I would, happy to get your feedback here. I would rather see some external rotation torque than internal. I would avoid internal rotation in a pressing movement. So if anything, we would want to kind of, you can look at like the antecubital space or your elbow pit, right? We should be able to see a little bit of that from this view here as we look at you from a superior to inferior view,
right?
Rather than seeing, the lateral aspect of the elbow or the acromion.
Now, if someone were to miss, so say, would you rather have someone with the elbows more flared out and abducted, or would you rather have them almost too close?
Yeah, I would err on the side of more adduction than abduction. So one of the common faults that we'll see in the push-up is too much abduction out to 90 degrees. We don't want that much. As we discussed in our shortened video, the test for glenohumeral impingement at the shoulder joint is abduction and internal rotation. So basically pouring something out of a can. And so we want to avoid that. It's not a healthy position for the shoulder. The more we abduct, the more, the way the humerus sits in that socket there, we're running into bony impinged space here. We run out of space when we abduct in that fashion. And so getting some external rotation and decreasing the amount of abduction down to about maybe 60, 75 degrees at most, but probably in that 45 to 60 range of abduction would be ideal.
Yeah, and this is critical in terms of, if we're talking about building some capacity here, building capacity or ability, it's critical that we're reinforcing that type of movement here, because as soon as we start adding on load on the bench press and we're in this position, now we're really in trouble. So if you think about it, imagine the amount of push-ups that you've done in your life, and if all of those are with subpar technique, it would only stand to reason that that's likely how your other movements are going to be manifested. So this is an opportunity, again, with body weight, so little resistance, to create good movement patterns and habits here. So we want to begin reinforcing those with no weight, so that when we add the weight, it's no problem. It's already ingrained, and we've already developed that movement pattern for us, or that, we've already developed the pattern. So setup pretty straightforward there. I'm going to go back to this side view.
Well, let's stay right there for a second, just so I can point out, similar to with our shortened video, the idea of stacking the elbow over the wrist is one that I think is an important one with any type of pressing movements. If we get, like, let's say we're doing an overhead press, and here's the weight, but my elbow is lateral, and I'm pressing this way. It's a mechanically inefficient position for one, but it's going to put more stress on the elbow joint than needed. So if I get into this position where it's neutral or vertical, we want to see stacked elbow over the wrist, and anytime we're pressing. So from a lateral view, you can see that the elbow is directly over the wrist. And then from that superior view, we saw that the elbows aren't going too far out laterally. They're not too far in medially. So we're not pressing from kind of almost like a skull crusher type position. We're getting the elbow stacked over the wrist joint. I think it's a very important point to look at. That will be determined by a combination of hand width and the amount or degree of glenohumeral abduction. So if your hands are in close, but you have a lot of abduction, you're not going to have a stacked wrist joint. Likewise, if your hands are out wide and you have adduction and no abduction, they're not stacked. So we need to find that balance of how much abduction does that width position of your hands support. Whatever it is, you have to match that up so we have a stacked elbow over the wrist.
Good point. So going into our execution, it's very similar to the setup. It's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to kind of slide my mouse here. So as we're seeing, we're going to the descent. So we're just going to simply be extending at the shoulder, flexing at the elbow. And the main focus here, again, as Dr. H mentioned, was keeping the elbow over the wrist. And you'll see that here, this stacked position. Another way to say this is a vertical forearm. And this I'm reminded of because remember, the shoulder is essentially the upper body version of the hip. The elbow is the upper body version of the knee, and the wrist is the upper body version of the ankle. Now, it's of course different, and this is almost would be like squatting with your feet behind your back. So that doesn't make sense. But as far as at the shoulder and the elbow, it's very similar idea with our squat. We don't need an absolutely vertical shin when we squat, but if we want to focus on this larger joint here, then we're going to want to do that. And now in the upper body, that's going to be our shoulder, anterior deltoid, or pec major. Whereas with the lower body, it would be more of our glutes and high hamstring region. But having this vertical forearm allows us to use this larger joint to move us through this range of motion. If I'm looking to press in front of me, I would much rather make the focus on my pec major and my deltoids than on my elbow, because if my elbow is not vertical and my elbow is angled more inferiorly, would that be the right is that anatomically? Basically, my elbows are now behind my wrist.
There's more elbow flexion there in that kind of position.
That's right. And we're putting ourselves at the deficit. That'd be like doing the press from here rather than this kind of stacked position. And so we're just trying to get ourselves and set ourselves up for both a mechanically healthy position for good form and to reduce the risk of injury, but also to be mechanically advantageous for strength and to actually matriculate through the movement.
And yeah, I 100% agree. I think the idea there, though, that you could also, maybe that's one of the variations, is you can put yourself at a mechanical disadvantage to then target, if we wanted to target the elbow joint more, by getting into more flexion, i.e. having the elbows kind of drop down closer to, in an inferior manner, closer to the hip. You're getting more elbow flexion. You're going to stress the elbow joint more. So if that's your goal, that would be one way to do it. So you look at people often will do a close grip push-up, because you wind up in a position where the elbow joint has more flexion. It's actually going to stress the elbow and the triceps to a greater degree. So you can use those mechanical positions to affect efficiency or inefficiency depending on the goal. So that's certainly a variation you can accomplish.
Yeah, so I'd argue my default is here, but now as we begin to talk about variations, I mean, so when I work with firefighters, I have them, one hand is on the ground and one hand is on a kettlebell, and they're doing these kind of offset push-ups. I'm just looking for ways to challenge their posture and position, but I'm not doing any of these variations until they have the basics down. If I have someone that's, one elbow's, flaring out while they go down, or I see these crazy mechanical issues, I'm not going to prescribe something more advanced like that. I'm going to be reserving it for once they've become so competent in the basics. Now let's start to change hand position, hand width. Let's use some slide push-ups and begin to challenge this movement more. But the foundation, the basics, this is what I'm looking for personally.
Agreed. Yeah, you talk about the idea of variation. To me, like, certainly you can adjust. I mean, people will always adjust, like foot height. You see kind of the foot elevated, or if let's say for the deconditioned athlete, a push-up, even a modified push-up, is too difficult. If we elevate the upper body, so where the hands are, okay, let's say at the very complete opposite would be a wall push-up, right? We have a vertical surface. There's very little resistance that's provided there, versus horizontal is the most we can get with the body weight. So somewhere in between, if you want them doing a push-up on a bench or something, at this level, there are ways to make it easier so that they can, if they're very deconditioned, you may need to start there and work your way down to a horizontal push-up.
Real quick.
Go ahead.
So you mentioned a wall push-up, which is something that I've prescribed in the past, and it makes sense to me, right? Just like what you're talking about, the more elevated our chest is, the easier this exercise is going to be. However, I've also found over time that when I'm doing a true wall push-up and my hands are on a wall, I'm getting into that more like elbow flex position here rather than keeping a stacked elbow. And so maybe you can speak to how to avoid that. And so I guess I'll start for you. But what I find is that because the wall is in front of our face, and we want to keep a true wall push-up keeps us from a neutral spine, because now I'm making sure that my forehead doesn't hit the wall. And then I'm also now getting into this more elbow dominant, if you will, push-up, rather than this kind of shoulder, pec major, and elbow kind of flow, if you will, maybe.
Well,
So what I found is that rather than doing a push-up to a wall, having some open space in front of your chest, basically give yourself the freedom to be able to move through that. For example, if you take a barbell and you set it up on a squat rack to where it's like belly button height or something like that, then we can walk our feet back as far as we can or need to, and then go down, so that we have a room for our face, more or less, and then we can articulate our shoulders and elbows in the right position.
Yeah, I think I've never actually prescribed wall push-ups, but the idea of something like what you
elevated
with an elevated, because I think, like you said, if your hands are stuck on a wall, so automatically your feet have to be out a little bit, right, just so we can get some change there. If your hands are stuck in this position, as you descend eccentrically, your head drops down in relation to where your hands are. So you have to start almost up here to get down to the position we'd want to be in at the bottom of the movement. So I think the way you discussed setting that up with the barbell is exactly what I would do as well, where we can adjust, rack height of the barbell and then drop it down. It's easier to drop that down too as we get closer and closer to a true push-up form. It's easier to do that.
Yeah, and also I found, for me personally, that if I set up the barbell to about shin height or just below my knee, and then I just get on there and start ripping as many push-ups as I can, man, that's one of the best pumps you will ever get in your chest as well as your triceps. And the thing is I like it better than the push-up because I can get more volume because I'm slightly elevated, and I can do that with healthy form. I can keep overloading with the push-up, but for whatever reason, I don't get that same kind of pump or localized.
It's a little bit more range of motion, a little more stretch at the bottom, for sure.
Yep. And so let's talk about variations again. That's another way, is to elevate the hands up, or give more room for the chest to come down and through. So instead of bringing my chest to the floor, if my hands are on some dumbbells, or if I'm on kind of oftentimes when I go to the gym, it's where, how they have the platform for a bench press, where they kind of fold those legs down for the spotter to be able to stand up and above the person bench pressing. I'll just put my hands on either side of that. You can put your hands on either side of a chair or anything to get this nice, real deep stretch. I found that to be another great variation too. Yeah.
I always so when we talk about variations, certainly adjusting the position of the body there's a handful of ways we can do that. I always like the idea of kind of adding external resistance, whether it be a chain or a band. Bands, I find especially, are really, really fun to work with push-ups because as we get to the top of the movement, it gets more difficult with the extra stretch of the band. So kind of just wrapping a band around your upper back and having the two ends in your hands and pressing from there. The use of chains kind of draped over you is a good way to add some external resistance. But those are pretty easy ways and very portable ways, especially with bands, to be able to add some external resistance and kind of manipulate. So maybe your base level of strength is high enough now to where you have no choice but to kind of develop the muscular hypertrophy, the upper ends of endurance, because of the reps that you're able to do. Certainly you can manipulate tempo. So, let's say a 5 count on the eccentric. Gotcha. That's one of the easy ways that you and I have kind of messed with that and found some success there. You talk about time under tension there with building that, a slow eccentric and then exploding up from the concentric. There's ways to combine any of those things. You can combine that with a band or with chains and turn it into a very hypertrophy specific type of loading pattern in that sense.
Yeah, I think if doing 10 push-ups with 5 seconds down, 5 seconds up, I mean, that's 10 seconds per push-up in theory, times 10, that's almost 2 minutes of time under tension. And that is brutal.
Yeah.
So whenever I get someone that just, and I do this a lot with the firefighters, they'll just bah, 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 pound out 50 of them. And I'm like, that's impressive. Try this. And they get to number 10 and they're just, ah! Like it's as if you have 8,000 pounds on you and you're bench pressing the world. It's pretty insane how heavy you can get, how quickly when it's this kind of constant tempo, time under tension. Now, I would prefer for the athlete, I wouldn't focus, and I'm curious to get your thoughts here. If I'm working with an athlete, I typically don't do a slow eccentric and a slow concentric. I'll go more to what you said specifically, where it's a controlled eccentric, slow as possible on the eccentric, and then blast off at the bottom, whether that's a squat, a push-up, a bench press. I don't want my athletes moving slow during the concentric phase. And I don't really want them going slow during the eccentric phase particularly either, but I'm less concerned with a slow eccentric than I am a slow concentric.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think if you've practiced that at all, like in your own training for the listener, where you're doing both slow eccentric and slow concentric, yes, it's difficult at the moment because of the time under tension.
Mm-hmm.
But the carryover, let's say, to strength, power, athletic type movements, you lose the value there.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're doing a slow and controlled eccentric, because of just the nature of eccentric contraction is better, you can overload that for the purposes of hypertrophy and strength better than you can concentric movements or concentric contractions, or it's better at developing those aspects. As long as there's discussion out there about the idea of using tension or tempo is the better way to say that. There's discussion around the idea of tempo, meaning like a slow eccentric to develop maybe some of the
coordination.
But specifically with muscle fiber type, like trying to, let's say we're trying to develop all of the muscle fibers for hypertrophy's sake. The idea that we're doing a slow eccentric to develop some of the slower twitch muscles, and then a fast concentric to then target the fast twitch muscle fibers that may exist. So I've seen some discussion there about that. I certainly find it to be more effective in terms of carryover and hypertrophy too. I mean, carryover to strength and power, but hypertrophy specifically. If I'm doing a slow concentric, I'm feeling like I'm getting weaker and slower versus faster and bigger.
Great pump though. It's slow concentric eccentric is a great pump. You're going to feel like it's different. And I would encourage, I mean, I wouldn't say that I've never had athletes do that, but that is definitely not the focus of the training. That's, hey, let's do something different today. Let's mix things up and let's, do something else. But the focus of our training, and I say this with athletes, but I would also say this even with general population, is control. I wouldn't even say a slow eccentric. I would say a controlled eccentric,
right?
A fast as possible concentric, of course, healthy, safe, under control. But I want it to be quick. I mean, we're trying to develop speed, strength, power, and that's done with quickness, not slow, grindy.
Yep. Agreed.
So we talked about execution kind of loosely through all of this. What about do you want to briefly discuss a modified version of a push-up? So not a variation there. So, I mean, I guess you can get caught up in the weeds with verbiage here, but when I think of a modified push-up, I'm thinking of what would in a testing setting be referred to as a female push-up. And so this is now, rather than pivoting from our toes, we're now going to be pivoting from our knees. And this also kind of was brought upon by a student asking about the proper technique. So according to the ACSM, when you're doing the push-up, one of the points of performance is making sure that our thighs aren't touching. Now, some of this has changed over time. I remember reading at one point where the thighs, the stomach and the chest should all be touching at the same time. And then I've also read where they shouldn't, the thighs and the stomach shouldn't touch. So I think it also depends on, do we have a target to reach to? If we have a can or a cup or a unit to touch our chest to for a point of performance, because you'll notice me going to my chest to the floor, I'm now at greater than 90 degrees of flexion at my elbow. And a standardized version You can either have the chest touch, because now I can see that the chest is touching the floor, or, and this is a lot easier to measure than exactly 90 degrees at the elbow. And it's a lot easier to do in the field, because if you have everyone go to touch their chest to a cup, someone that has longer limbs, this may be different versus someone that has shorter limbs. So as far as in the field, I believe personally that touching the chest to the floor is the most standardized way of getting there. But there's other modes that would require you to only achieve 90 degrees of elbow flexion, hence putting a tool or unit, an object at the chest. So, and jump in and tell me if I'm wrong here as well. But those are the two variations that I've commonly seen as far as a standardized test. Now, that can be more difficult when we're now pivoting from the knees, meaning keeping our thighs, our midsection off of the ground, because the line of action is now shorter, or the pivot point is shorter. So let's take a peek. The setup is the exact same, but instead of a straight line from the crown of our head out through our heels, it's going to be out through our knee. So let's watch a couple versions here. Now, for me, you know, my hips are probably a little bit too flexed. I was, quite honestly, as I was going through this movement, I was thinking about how I could not get my thighs to touch the ground. And then that caused me to have a little bit of hip flexion here.
Mm-hmm.
So I would rather, to be quite honest, I would have liked to have seen my hips a little bit more extended personally, but I don't think, I wouldn't have called this a bad rep either. So again, we're at the ground here, and bad timing. So let's go to a fresh rep. So here, the chest is more or less on the ground. My thighs are on the ground. So I've made contact with everything, but you'll notice let's see the timing of this. And I think that's probably the biggest thing for me is the timing here. So we're going down. The thighs are slightly touching. There is some flexion at my hip, but my chest is touching. So we go up, and then let's come back down. And you'll notice that the thighs are essentially touching at the same time as my chest. So what would you say to this, Dr. H?
In what sense? Like just as far as technique wise, or what?
Yeah, as far as technique, like, because the student brought up to you that how do we do this push-up without the thighs touching?
Right.
And so speak to what the heart or the spirit of that comment is, rather than the perhaps execution.
Yeah, so I think I think there's I don't know that I want to call it an error in maybe the textbook definition of, hey, you can't let your thighs touch. They have to, like you because of your knee being the pivot point,
Mm-hmm.
you can't keep your, you know, at least the distal third of your quadriceps there, or the femur, from touching the ground. It's going to. Otherwise, the only way you would avoid that is by having even more hip flexion. So your butt's up in the air, and you know you're kind of, you know, in this type of position.
Real quick, or if there's a target. Now, if there's a target, because again, here you'll notice too that I'm greater than 90 degrees of flexion at the elbow. In all reality, can you see my cursor on that side?
Yep.
So in all reality, 90 degrees of elbow flexion would probably be more in this range here. So if I had a target that was 4 or 5 inches, I might not hit, I'm still going to hit some part of my quads, some part of my thighs. But if we have a target and we're only going to 90 degrees of elbow flexion, yes, there's probably going to be less likely of a chance that my thighs, or the majority of my thighs, are going to be touching the ground. But there's going to be some degree, to your point, that are touching because my knees are the pivot point.
Yeah. So there's some that's unavoidable, depending on, again, how much you know, flexion of the elbow is taking place, where the chest is supposed to be touching, etc. But the main idea, I think, that we would convey for both, you know, the modified push-up and the standard push-up, is neutral spine, you know, from the head to the pivot point, wherever the pivot point is, whether it's the knee or the toes. And the key with the idea of don't let the thighs touch the ground, and I believe the spirit of that instruction is, if we get the thighs resting on the ground and supporting body weight, we're moving away from the purpose of the movement, and we're losing some of that. The term I used was connected tension.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about the idea of kind of the supporting structure here for an arch is the underside. And similar with the body in this position, the weight of gravity is pulling us downward. So the anterior aspect of the body, so the abdominals, the hip flexors, there needs to be connected tension from the upper body to the lower body. And if we lose that, if we get into thoracic or lumbar or thoracic extension, or the pelvis is supported on the ground, the thighs are completely supported on the ground, we don't have that complete tension from head to pivot point. And that's what we want to see. We need to see tension all the way through with a neutral spine. And so one of the errors that you'll commonly see with people doing the push-up, if they're deconditioned, is the lower body will be still supported, and the first thing to move up will be the head or the upper thoracic spine. You'll see kind of almost like this type of thing where the hips and the pelvis are here, and this is coming up first. They'll kind of do like
it's like the worm.
Yeah, it's like a worm, or I was going to say, what's the yoga move? Is that
like a
cobra, I think?
Yeah, cobra.
It's basically that, where they're pressing the upper body first, and then, oh, okay, now I'll get my hips and glutes up. Whereas we want to see everything moving together with that connected tension.
And what's that? So let's connect the dots from earlier in the conversation. That sagging hip, what is that lacking then? By the hip sagging, what is, in our minds, what is that then lacking? What is that individual struggling with? Whether it's through strength or through coordination.
It could be coordination, but in most cases, I think it's I don't know.
I'm saying think outside of the shoulder and the elbow. Remember what we were talking about is that low-hanging fruit of engaging the trunk.
Yeah, it's trunk.
Yeah, and like, here's the thing. You can flex your abs even when your spine is extended, but if we're looking to create this kind of balanced, neutral spine, then it's different. That 99% of the people don't have the muscular coordination to be truly contracting their abdominals while they're in this overly extended spinal position. So what I see is that it becomes now very shoulder and elbow dominant, and then the rest of the body almost becomes obsolete or superfluous at that point because there's no tension there. And that could be due to, I'm just trying to get this rep done because my shoulders and elbows can't handle the load, or I'm not strong enough there. And so I'm willing to let my lower body sag in and kind of lay down into it versus kind of keeping this, rigid posture. But if that's the case, maybe this push-up right here is not for you yet. You're not ready for that. And that's fine too. But let's not create these poor habits of trunk rigidity and the need for the isometric contraction to keep a neutral spine.
Say that again. Say that last part again. Trunk rigidity and neutral spine. I'm not sure I'm following.
So I'm saying that rather than doing even this version of a modified push-up, I would have the person go onto that barbell that's belly button height.
If they can't maintain rigidity.
That's right. Because here, I mean, and we want to see that same rigidity on on that version too. What I'm saying is that as important as it is to achieve this kind of horizontal push, I don't want to do the horizontal push at the expense of missing out on all the other things that are involved in this movement. Although secondary, they're still critical components. So if we're not keeping the spine neutral and the trunk rigid, then for this modified version, I would look to another version. And if we're still struggling with that, then that means that maybe we focus now on the trunk before we even get to because at that point, the trunk is our core, is the center, and our shoulder is an extremity in relation to our trunk. Mm-hmm. So it just stands to reason for me personally, we got to strengthen your trunk before we even get to an extremity like that or distal from that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on, as we discussed the idea of, early on, like, hey, I'd rather see less abduction of the shoulder than more. Mm-hmm. In this sense, would you rather see a hollow body, kind of this, like a supported arch versus sagging position?
Well, but here's the thing. A hollow position to me does not mean hip flexion. Does that make sense? It means that there's more flow from my spine through my hip, through my legs. Yeah. This is hollow to me. But if someone is like this is not hollowed. Agreed. To me personally. So if they can achieve, in fact, you might even want a hollow body position more than you would want even just a neutral position, because that's even more engagement to me. So yes, I would err on the side of neutral in general, but if it's a true hollow position and it's kind of more rounded rather than like a V shape.
Yep.
Hollow position. I mean, you look at any gymnast and they're going to be in a hollowed position rather than even this neutral, because everything they do, there's like this aesthetic component where they want that position. So,
well, and you also talk about the idea of developing core strength or trunk strength. A hollow body is exactly that.
Because now we're talking about the serratus anterior, we're talking about muscles up through even our actual like thoracic region, not just our lumbar region. So it's not just the lower abs here, it's from the lower ab where it crosses into the femur and like this hip area, but it also moves up into the thoracic region, which that's now again recruiting more musculature and building more strength and endurance through the trunk.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So you got anything else?
Did we get into common faults?
I think we did all throughout, where the elbows are going to flare out. So just to summarize there, elbows are flaring out through abduction, and then through the motion itself is more of an internal rotation, or horizontal adduction and abduction, which is more of a transverse rather than frontal plane issue.
How do you fix that? Let's talk about fixing faults.
Good point. For me, it's going to be more so cueing. Is like, I think if people can do a handful of push-ups like this, they might be able to do less here. They will be able to do less here. I find that most people, even though this is truly a stronger position, I find that people struggle to do more push-ups correctly initially, but then they've developed the strength to do it correctly, and then they can do more of the bad ones if they really wanted to.
So what do you, I mean, for you, how do you assess that as to why would people kind of default to more of this position? And what, I think, for the student who may be watching this and trying to put the pieces together of why is this happening and why do I want to fix this? What is more stressed in this position? What muscles are used more here versus here?
I think people getting into that position reminds me of a natural kind of like stressed out position, or like, when we get stressed, our shoulders start to elevate and we kind of get in this like balled up kind of position perhaps. And when we're not, we're free and we're able to kind of like set our shoulders down and set the table on them. Let me default this by saying this is my opinion. This is not a like scientific fact. And quite frankly, I'm not sure if I've come across any like specific reason as to why people get into that position. Maybe you do, I'd be encouraged to hear that. But for me, I think most people are basically just stressed out, and this manifests into this in a push-up. That's my kind of anecdotal, observation perhaps. But I find that, and I see the same thing in a pull-up. People's default is this rather than keeping the shoulder blades retracted and depressed.
Yeah. I would lean more towards, if we're abducting more, it's going to be more anterior deltoid and pec. Mm-hmm. And if like, basically to me, I'd say the root cause is a tricep weakness. If they're not able to support proper pushing here, I think it's going to be more of a weakness in the triceps, and I'm relying on maybe the strength or the support from the shoulder joint rather than kind of combining the two together. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it could be a coordination issue of learning how to press with both the shoulder and elbow together. Mm-hmm. But I would lean more towards that being a weakness in the triceps that needs to be developed first.
Now, yes, but so the pec major is a shoulder flexor. Like it's not its prime function, but it's a shoulder flexor. So why do you think it being a shoulder flexor, is it just a mechanical thing you think out here rather than here?
Do you think it's more of a flex? I think what is it? The upper fibers of the pec major work in shoulder flexion versus you get more of the medial or the middle and lower fibers working in adduction, horizontal adduction.
So there's just a better chance for firing the muscle in total at a higher rate if it's out wide. But if that's the case, then is that the happy medium of that kind of 45 to 60 degree angle here, to where we're recruiting more? It's not like the chest isn't working. It's just as we change these positions, there's more demand placed on different areas, right? So so maybe that does speak to some of the value in a little bit wider of a hand position, elbows a little bit flared out. I think maybe to double back or to clarify is that my default for a push-up is to be in that 45, because when we transfer to the bench press and we transfer to sport, like if I saw a lineman trying to block someone like this, I'd be like, oh, sweet, I'm going to get this guy all day because I can get up and under and really control this person, right? If in jiu-jitsu, someone is defending with their elbows up and out, man, you're going to get in trouble so fast. You're taught to be in this kind of A-frame position right here. So most things, I don't see many things being beneficial to be pushing this way. And I think part of that is because now we're further away from our center of mass, if anything. So we're stronger if we're in more tight. So I would say my default is going to be the 45-degree angle, but there's absolutely room for messing around with that, especially with something like this. Push-ups get boring. I know for me, with limited gym access right now, push-ups are the foundation, in addition to the pull-up and some kettlebell work, the foundation of my training right now. So I go close grip, wide grip, standard grip. I'll offset my hands. I'll put one hand on my kettlebell while I'm going, just to try to mix the thing up. That's where I'm at.
So as far as getting back to, let's say, fixing the shoulder issue of here, certainly there's some cueing involved with just instructing, and maybe going back to a bar, kind of an elevated bar, and kind of, hey, we want to see, we want to see more of this. And I think one of the easy ways for people to do that is to try and stretch the pec. You don't get much of a stretch up here. You don't get much of a stretch here, but you get a nice stretch right here.
Almost like a fly.
Yeah, right. And so getting them to kind of feel that position, coaching and cueing, I think, is effective there. Just explaining, we don't want to see this, explaining why. Anything else you find effective for fixing shoulder, shoulder abduction issue?
Yeah, for me, it's one of the biggest benefits, and this is also to do with the spine as well, is I actually have people start on the ground. So I don't have them, hey, get in this plank position and we're set up in push-up position. I have them start on the ground, and if their elbows and hands are here, I almost get them oriented to where they need to be. And I also remind them, this neutral, like, your spine is now straight. You're in contact with the floor. So from here, just press straight up. Now, it depends, because people that have the strength to do that, it clicks for them right away. But people that might not have the strength, they'll go and they'll kind of wiggle and they'll get into some trouble. So, but you can do the same thing on that elevated barbell. Get them to where their chest is resting on the bar, and then have them fix their elbow position, and then say, I want you to squeeze at your midsection and then press straight back.
Yeah, I like that.
So
what about
or from the bottom up also is helpful.
Yeah. What about for issues of trunk, whether it be too much extension or kind of the V, so not a hollow position, but a V? Let's stick with extension first, since that's the more common issue.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just reminding them, and that, I mean, what warm-up am I always going to say all day, every day? It's a dead bug. Because that position is tried and true throughout everything. So if I can get someone to hold a dead bug for 30 seconds, one, I know that I've developed the amount of strength needed in them to be able to transfer it to this, but I've also developed this kind of mind to muscle control where I can say dead bug position, neutral spine, and they understand what that means. The only difference here is that it's inverted. I'm on my back instead of on my stomach. So, and then again, so there's that as far as developing the strength to be able to do that. But the coordination of it, it would be, again, starting from the bottom and saying, I need your hips to leave the same time everything else does. And it's just kind of reverse engineering it, starting it from the bottom up.
Do you find, so I certainly find this, I'm curious if you do as well, that it's often easier to coach trunk issues away from the movement that's being requested?
Yep. Because to most people, the trunk's not involved here. This is not a trunk exercise, which it's not. I mean, it's an upper body push, but it's, again, low-hanging fruit. That doesn't, just because a push-up isn't a trunk exercise doesn't mean that the trunk's not involved. The trunk is involved in every single thing you'll do. Even when you overextend the spine during a bench press, and you see some of those people where they're overly extended, they're still, I guarantee you, bearing down on their midsection. That's just a silly technique that maybe we'll address another day. But It
Well, I mean,
works.
talk about mechanical advantage. That's what it
Yeah.
is. Right?
Yeah.
It's using the rules of competition to your advantage to shorten
Correct.
the range of motion of a lift. So
Right.
the thing I would mention here, as this is actually a really good picture of you here, is one of the visuals I always like to give people is imagining the pelvis and the rib cage as
Mm,
buckets of water.
yeah.
And if we get them spilling in different directions, so if the pelvis in this case is kind of, I mean,
Anteriorly
it's
tilted.
more hip flexion than anything, but
Yeah.
there's a little bit of anterior tilt there.
Hmm.
Versus the rib cage has some posterior tilt, so they're tilted in opposite directions. Whereas we want to keep the buckets neutral, so the rib cage stacked over the pelvis, even as we shift position. So a push-up ideally might be here
Hmm.
versus kind of breaking that into that anterior tilted pelvis, posteriorly tilted rib cage.
Hmm.
This would be a better example of that. Yeah. So pulling them away from the push-up or whatever movement they're doing and teaching those ideas of rib cage and pelvic connection there, versus as soon as we start extending the rib cage upwards, we're going to lose that connected
Hmm.
tension. The idea I talked about before of connected tension between the upper and lower body, it's connected at the trunk in the midsection. So that's one of the keys there, I think, in terms of fixing that movement is getting the client to understand and actually kinesthetically working through that. One of the ways that I find is easy to do that in a almost, you could do it in the dead bug. You could also flip flop it in a quadruped position.
Yeah.
So that we're on the hands and knees and have them go into extension, go into flexion. Okay, now find the middle ground.
Yep.
And now feel how there's more connection, there's tension there. We can create tension versus if we're in extension, I mean, you extend your rib cage up, it's hard to create good tension in the abdominals there. Same thing. If you flex, you can do a little bit more because those muscles are contracted, but then you lose connection in the erectors.
Right.
In order to maximize both of those, we want that neutral position where we can tense everything.
Yeah. I like that. I like that approach to the cat cow, like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Extended, flexed spine, and then finding the middle ground and having people do that with their muscles, not just, I think that's a topic for another day, as far as like, how do you mentally cue people through some of these things? And that goes to the importance of giving them different types of cues, mechanical, emotional, and tactile. You might be able to tell someone to like, hey, I want you to let your belly kind of reach down to the ground. And then I want you to reach your back up to the sky. So that's more of this kind of like mechanical type thing. But a tactile might be, you put your hand above them and below them, and then their midsections in between. You say, okay, touch my top hand. And they have to figure out how to do that. Touch my bottom hand. They have to figure out that. Now you close the distance between your hands, and then they're finding where that neutral position is, but you're not putting them there. You're
Right.
forcing them to find what that is for them, and then they can kind of map that out and develop the coordination themselves.
Yep.
So
Good stuff.
awesome. Well, I would say that we probably talked about the push-up longer than anyone in the history of ever. So we should call up the Guinness Book of Records, submit our video,
We've
and
done
get
it.
on the record books, man.
We've done it. We've
Yeah.
completely discussed the push-up.
Yeah. So anyways, we got the shortened version, the long version. This, of course, is the long version, but hopefully there's a lot of nuance. These things are simple and they're straightforward, but there is a lot of room to talk about these things. And so hopefully you guys glean some insight from this. And I know I always do. Just the last comment you made about finding someone in the quadruped position and having them orient their spine. I typically default to what works for me, and you'll share what works for you, but we can also continue to develop and add tools to our toolbox. So we're doing that just like we hope you all are doing that are listening and watching this. We hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and look forward to our next movement technique, and of course the other topics that we have for the month set up. So see y'all soon.
Thanks, everybody.